In the late 1970s, deep in the mountains of Colombia, an empire was born from white powder and ruthless ambition. The Medellín Cartel transformed cocaine from a secret vice into a global obsession, flooding the world with profit and terror while turning Pablo Escobar into the most feared man alive. ChatGPT said in the early 1970s, Colombia was a country divided by poverty and power. Its lush mountains and sprawling jungles concealed a secret that would soon reshape the global underworld. Deep within the Medellín Valley, young men with ambition far greater than their means began to see a new kind of opportunity, one that didn't rely on gold or oil, but on an unassuming white powder known only to the elite as cocaine. What began as small-scale smuggling through Caribbean routes would soon evolve into one of the most violent and profitable empires the world had ever seen. The transformation began with a generation of traffickers who understood that cocaine could travel farther and earn more than any other drug before it. By the mid-1970s, cocaine demand in the United States had exploded among the wealthy, driven by nightclubs, Wall Street, and Hollywood. At first, the trade was fragmented, run by small operations scattered across Colombia and Peru. But then came men who saw the potential for scale. Among them was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, a young smuggler from Rio Negro who began his criminal career transporting contraband cigarettes and stolen cars. He learned logistics, bribery, and intimidation in the underbelly of Medellín, and when cocaine entered the scene, Escobar understood it wasn't just another product, it was the future. Escobar partnered with other ambitious figures. Carlos Leder, a half-German pilot with a vision for aerial trafficking, the Ochoa brothers, George Luis, Fabio, and Juan David, who brought wealth and organization, and José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, a ruthless enforcer known as El Mexicano. Together, they formed an alliance that would soon dominate every link of the cocaine chain, from production to transport to distribution. They called themselves La Oficina de Envigado, but the world would come to know them as the Medellín Cartel. Their operation expanded rapidly. They purchased vast tracts of land in Colombia's countryside to establish cocaine laboratories. The raw coca leaf came from Bolivia and Peru, flown into jungle airstrips where chemists refined it into pure cocaine hydrochloride. From there, shipments moved north, first by boat, then by plane, and later through intricate networks of couriers, mules, and submarines. Carlos Leder's innovation changed everything. He used a small Bahamian island called Norman's Cay as a transshipment hub, allowing cocaine to be stored, refueled, and flown directly into Florida with minimal risk. Each flight carried hundreds of kilos, worth millions on the streets of Miami. By the late 1970s, Miami had become the front line of a silent invasion. Cocaine poured into the city faster than law enforcement could comprehend. The money was staggering, billions of dollars flowing from American consumers into Colombian hands. Banks in Miami saw sudden floods of cash deposits in small bills. Nightclubs overflowed with cocaine, fueled excess, and a wave of violence began to follow the trade. The Medellín Cartel had found its foothold. Escobar used his newfound wealth to buy influence. He bribed police officers, judges, and politicians, ensuring protection for his shipments. In Medellín, he became both a criminal and a benefactor, building soccer fields, housing projects, and churches for the poor. To the slums, he was El Patron, a man who brought prosperity to those forgotten by the state. Yet behind the generosity lay a system of terror. Anyone who stood in the cartel's way faced a simple choice: plata o plomo, silver or lead. As the 1980s dawned, the cocaine boom reached unprecedented heights. The cartel's production soared. and so did its methods of concealment. Cocaine was hidden in food shipments, electronics, and even within live animals. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, began to recognize the scale of the operation, but by then, the Medellín Cartel was generating an estimated $60 million a day. Escobar's personal fortune climbed into the billions, placing him on Forbes' list of the world's richest men. The cartel's influence extended beyond Colombia. It reached Panama, where General Manuel Noriega offered protection for laundering operations. It reached Mexico, where early trafficking networks cooperated to move shipments north. It reached the Caribbean, where islands became stepping stones for the endless flow of cocaine into Miami, New York, and Los Angeles. The world's appetite seemed insatiable. Cocaine had become the currency of the decade, symbolizing power, wealth, and rebellion. But with expansion came blood. In Miami, local distributors and Colombian hitmen known as sicarios waged open warfare on the streets. The cocaine cowboys era began, marked by daylight assassinations, drive-by shootings, and machine gun battles. The Dadeland Mall massacre in 1979 was a turning point. Gunmen linked to the Medellín Cartel opened fire in a public shopping center, leaving chaos and bodies in their wake. The message was clear. Miami belonged to the cocaine trade. Law enforcement agencies in the United States began to respond with new strategies. The DEA intensified surveillance, Coast Guard patrols increased, and prosecutors sought to dismantle the financial networks behind the trade. Yet the cartel's resources were almost limitless. They laundered money through real estate, offshore accounts, and legitimate businesses. Cash was buried in barrels, sealed in walls, or flown back to Colombia by the ton. The Medellín Cartel had become not just a criminal enterprise, but an international corporation fueled by greed and violence. In Colombia, Escobar's ambitions grew beyond the drug world. He sought legitimacy and political power. In 1982, he was elected as an alternate member of the Colombian Congress, entering the halls of government as a symbol of success to some and a warning to others. But his presence drew scrutiny. Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla began to investigate Escobar's fortune and connections, denouncing him as a narco-trafficker. Escobar's carefully crafted public image began to crumble. When Lara was assassinated in 1984 by cartel gunmen, the illusion vanished completely. The Colombian government declared war on the cartel. Extradition to the United States became the cartel's greatest fear. Washington and Bogotá signed treaties allowing Colombian traffickers to be tried in U.S. courts where corruption couldn't protect them. Escobar and his partners responded with terror. Judges, journalists, and police officers were targeted. Bombings struck government buildings, airplanes, and shopping centers. The cartel's message echoed through every explosion, no extradition. At the height of its power, the Medellín Cartel controlled nearly 80% of the world's cocaine market. Its network stretched from the jungles of the Andes to the nightclubs of Manhattan. In the barrios of Medellín, young men were recruited by the thousands, drawn by promises of wealth or loyalty to Escobar's myth. Children grew up idolizing him, believing he fought for the poor against the elites. But beneath that myth lay an empire sustained by fear. Rival traffickers who refused cooperation were executed. Informants disappeared. Entire families were wiped out as examples. The cartel's methods became increasingly sophisticated. Aircraft were modified with hidden compartments and advanced navigation systems. Submarines and fishing boats carried loads through the Caribbean. Corruption reached deep into institutions, from local police to high-ranking officials. Even parts of the military were compromised. the line between state and cartel blurred in many regions. Meanwhile, in the United States, cocaine consumption was transforming the social landscape. What had started as a recreational drug of the rich spread rapidly through urban communities, giving rise to crack cocaine in the mid-1980s. The epidemic brought addiction, crime, and political backlash. American officials began to see the Medellín Cartel not just as a foreign criminal problem, but as a direct threat to national stability. The DEA, CIA, and other agencies ramped up intelligence operations across Latin America, working with Colombian counterparts to identify cartel routes and leadership structures. Escobar's empire grew more volatile. His relationship with his partners began to fracture. Carlos Leda, once his key ally, became a liability after drawing too much attention to himself. In 1987, Leda was captured in Colombia and extradited to the United States, the very fate Escobar feared most. Leda's arrest showed that the cartel's shield of immunity was beginning to crack. The Ochoa brothers, who had always favored negotiation over war, started to distance themselves from Escobar's escalating violence. Despite these cracks, Escobar maintained control through brutality. His assassins carried out targeted killings against anyone seen as an enemy of the cartel, journalists like Guillermo Cano, judges like Carlos Valencia, and countless police officers who dared to resist. In 1989, a bomb exploded aboard Avianca Flight 203, killing all 107 people on board. Escobar had ordered it, believing a presidential candidate opposing him was among the passengers. That same year, a massive truck bomb destroyed the headquarters of the Colombian intelligence agency DAS in Bogotá, killing more than 50 people. These acts of terror turned Colombia into a war zone and Escobar into one of the most wanted men on earth. The United States intensified its involvement. American intelligence and military advisors began training Colombian special forces, sharing technology for tracking and surveillance. The joint effort, codenamed Operation Search Block, aimed to dismantle the Medellín Cartel once and for all. Helicopters patrolled the mountains and raids struck cartel safe houses. Yet Escobar remained elusive, protected by an army of loyalists and a vast network of informants. While the violence raged, the cocaine business continued. The cartel had built such an extensive infrastructure that even when key figures were captured or killed, operations persisted. Cocaine laboratories in the jungle kept running, flights still departed from hidden airstrips, and shipments still reached American shores. The demand never slowed. In Medellín, Escobar's paranoia grew. Surrounded by enemies and hunted by both the Colombian government and rival cartels, he turned inward. His luxury estate, Hacienda Untold, became a fortress filled with guards, weapons, and even a private zoo. He trusted fewer people, relying on his family and a shrinking circle of lieutenants. As pressure mounted, the once unified Medellín Cartel began to fracture under its own weight. By 1990, the Colombian government, exhausted by years of bloodshed, sought peace negotiations. Escobar proposed surrender in exchange for guarantees against extradition. Remarkably, the government accepted. He built his own prison, La Catedral, equipped with lavish amenities, telephones, and even a waterfall. Officially, he was imprisoned. In reality, he continued to run his empire from within its walls. It was a temporary victory, a pause in a storm that was far from over. Inside La Catedral, Escobar ordered executions of rivals and disloyal associates, provoking outrage when news leaked. The government, under U.S. pressure, attempted to transfer him to a real prison. But in July 1992, Escobar escaped through a hole in the wall, vanishing into the mountains surrounding Medellín. What followed was one of the most intense manhunts in modern history. The first half of the Medellín Cartel story ends here, with the empire at its peak yet crumbling from within, its leader on the run, and an entire nation caught between fear and retribution. The cocaine boom had built fortunes, toppled governments, and buried thousands. What came next would determine not just Escobar's fate, but the future of Colombia itself. When Pablo Escobar slipped through the walls of La Cathedral in July 1992, Colombia entered a new phase of fear and uncertainty. The illusion of his imprisonment had ended, and what followed was a war without rules. The government, humiliated by his escape, unleashed every available resource to capture him. The United States increased its involvement, deploying intelligence experts, surveillance aircraft, and satellite tracking to assist Colombian forces. The elite unit, known as the Search Bloc, reassembled under General Hugo Martinez, tasked with a single objective: find and neutralize Escobar. Escobar vanished into the hills outside Medellín, using the labyrinth of neighborhoods he once controlled as both shield and weapon. He moved constantly, hiding in safe houses and rural farms, surrounded by a shrinking group of loyal bodyguards. Even in hiding, he retained influence. His network of informants stretched across the city, warning him of police movements and betrayals. The poor neighborhoods of Medellín, built with his money years earlier, remained loyal out of gratitude, fear, or both. For a time, he remained untouchable, but the world outside his hideouts had changed. The Medellín Cartel that once dominated the global cocaine trade was fracturing. Without its centralized leadership, smaller factions splintered off, each seeking control over routes and profits. Meanwhile, a rival force rose in the north, the Cali Cartel, led by the Rodriguez Orjuela brothers, who preferred discretion over violence. The Cali traffickers built alliances with law enforcement and foreign agencies, presenting themselves as businessmen while quietly taking over much of Escobar's market. They began to feed intelligence about Escobar's movements to the authorities, accelerating his downfall. The United States, determined to end the chaos, increased cooperation with the Colombian government through intelligence sharing programs. Technology became their advantage. U.S. surveillance planes equipped with advanced listening equipment hovered over Medellín, tracking radio signals and phone transmissions. Escobar, once careful, was forced into isolation. Every call he made risked exposure, yet his need to communicate with his family often betrayed him. By 1993, the once mighty Medellín Cartel had become a shadow of itself. Many of Escobar's lieutenants were captured or dead. José Gonzalo Rodríguez Garcha had been killed in a firefight in 1989. The Oco brothers surrendered to authorities in exchange for lenient treatment. Carlos Leder was already serving a life sentence in the United States. Escobar was now alone at the center of a collapsing empire. His enemies multiplied beyond the government. A mysterious group emerged calling itself Los Peps, Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, or People Persecuted by Pablo Escobar. They were a paramilitary coalition made up of former cartel rivals, vigilantes, and victims' families, allegedly supported by factions within the security forces and with indirect assistance from the Cali cartel. Los Peeps launched a campaign of terror against Escobar's associates, killing lawyers, accountants, relatives, and anyone suspected of helping him. Their attacks were brutal and relentless. Safe houses were burned, properties destroyed, and the psychological warfare pushed Escobar further into isolation. As his world narrowed, Escobar's paranoia deepened. He distrusted even his closest bodyguards. He moved his family from one safe house to another, eventually attempting to send them abroad. In late 1993, his wife and children sought asylum in Germany, but the request was denied. They found temporary refuge in a Bogota hotel under government protection, a painful distance from the man who had once ruled the country through fear. Escobar's desperation to hear his family's voices led him to use the telephone, one of the few mistakes that would eventually seal his fate. Throughout that year, Medellín remained a battlefield. The search block conducted daily raids, relying on tip-offs and intercepted communications. Soldiers stormed neighborhoods, tearing through the brick walls of houses in search of tunnels and hidden rooms. Each day brought new rumors. Escobar spotted in a taxi, Escobar in the countryside, Escobar disguised as a priest. For months, nothing concrete emerged. Yet the circle was tightening. On December 1st, 1993, Escobar turned 44. He celebrated quietly, hiding in a modest house in the Los Olivos district of Medellín. The next day, he made a call to his son, Juan Pablo, speaking for several minutes. What he didn't know was that the signal had been traced. Using radio triangulation, a Colombian intelligence team pinpointed the exact location of the call. Search block units, accompanied by special forces, surrounded the area. At around 2 p.m. on December 2nd, 1993, soldiers closed in. Escobar, realizing he was trapped, tried to escape across the rooftops. A brief gunfight erupted. He was shot multiple times before collapsing on the red tiles of a nearby house. The photo of his lifeless body, face pressed against the roof, became a global symbol, the end of the world's most notorious drug lord. Whether he was killed by the police or took his own life remains debated, but his empire was finished. The reign of the Medellín Cartel had come to a violent close. Colombia erupted in mixed emotions. Some celebrated in the streets, believing the nightmare was finally over. Others mourned the man who had built homes and soccer fields in their neighborhoods. The country that had lived under his shadow for over a decade was suddenly without its most feared and powerful figure. Yet, as the dust settled, it became clear that the cocaine trade had not died with Escobar. It had simply evolved. In the aftermath of his death, the structure of the Medellín Cartel dissolved almost immediately. Remaining traffickers either surrendered, fled, or were absorbed into rival organizations. The Cali cartel took advantage of the power vacuum, expanding rapidly across Latin America. Led by Gilberto and Miguel Rodríguez Orejuela and their associates Pacho Herrera and Cheap Santa Cruz, the Cali network became the new face of Colombian trafficking. Unlike Escobar's open warfare, the Cali group preferred quiet infiltration, bribing officials, manipulating politics, and running their empire like a multinational corporation. By the mid-1990s, they controlled nearly 80% of the world's cocaine supply, the same share once held by Medellín. The Colombian government, however, had learned from the Escobar era. With American assistance, authorities began targeting Cali's leadership with precision operations. In 1995, a coordinated crackdown led to the arrest of the Rodríguez Orejuela brothers, marking another major victory in the war on drugs. But even as these empires fell, smaller groups emerged, each more fragmented and harder to track. The global cocaine network, once centralized under the Medellín Cartel, shifted westward. Mexican traffickers, once mere transport partners, began asserting control over the trade. Organizations like the Sinaloa Cartel, led by Joaquin, El Chapo, Guzman, and the Guadalajara and Juarez cartels inherited roots, contacts, and infrastructure originally built by Escobar's generation. The center of gravity in the drug trade moved north, signaling the dawn of a new era. In Colombia, the scars left by the Medellín years ran deep. Thousands of lives had been lost: judges, police officers, journalists, politicians, and civilians caught in the crossfire. Cities rebuilt themselves slowly, haunted by memories of car bombs and assassinations. Medellín, once synonymous with violence, began transforming through urban renewal projects, education programs, and community initiatives. Over time, the city reclaimed its name, though the ghost of Escobar never fully faded. The international impact of the Medellín Cartel reshaped law enforcement across continents. The United States introduced new anti-money laundering laws, expanded extradition treaties, and created specialized task forces to trace narcotics profits. Cooperation between Latin American governments and U.S. agencies intensified, giving rise to decades of joint operations under the banner of the War on Drugs. The legacy of the cocaine boom extended far beyond the men who profited from it. In the 1980s, the flood of cocaine into the United States had changed entire communities. Crack cocaine, derived from powder cocaine, devastated urban neighborhoods, fueling addiction and crime. The U.S. government responded with strict sentencing laws and zero-tolerance policies, which reshaped criminal justice systems for generations. Billions were spent on interdiction, border control, and rehabilitation, yet the demand for the drug persisted. In Colombia, Escobar's death didn't end the violence. It merely shifted its form. Leftist guerrilla groups like the FARC and right-wing paramilitaries began financing their operations through cocaine production. Entire rural regions became zones of conflict where farmers cultivated coca not out of loyalty to cartels, but out of economic necessity. The war on drugs merged with Colombia's civil war, blurring lines between politics, insurgency, and organized crime. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, new cartels emerged, smaller, decentralized, and more adaptable. Groups like Norte del Valle filled the vacuum left by Cali's decline, while others aligned with Mexican networks to move cocaine north. Technology and globalization gave these organizations new tools: encrypted communication, offshore banking, and complex supply chains spanning continents. Yet even as new players rose, the legend of Medellín endured. Films, books, and television series revisited Escobar's story, turning his life into myth. For some, he remained a symbol of defiance against authority. For others, a cautionary tale of greed and destruction. His former home, Hacienda Nápoles, was transformed into a theme park. Tourists came to see remnants of a man who once held a nation hostage, his story now part of Colombia's reluctant history. The economic and political consequences of the cocaine boom continued to echo. Money laundering networks, built during the 1980s, had infiltrated global financial systems, exposing weaknesses in banks and offshore institutions. Governments worldwide strengthened financial regulations, tracing suspicious cash flows that often led back to narcotics trafficking. Yet the sheer profitability of cocaine ensured that new traffickers would always emerge to replace the fallen. For Colombia, the post-Medellín years became a long process of rebuilding trust. The police and judiciary, once deeply infiltrated by corruption, underwent reform. Extradition to the United States resumed after years of suspension, signaling a new era of cooperation. By the early 2000s, international pressure and domestic reform began to weaken the large cartels, but they were replaced by what officials called micro-cartels, smaller, agile networks that operated under the radar. In the United States, cocaine consumption fluctuated with time, but its cultural imprint remained. The drug that had fueled Wall Street excess in the 1980s and devastated communities in the 1990s became a lasting symbol of power, danger, and addiction. The profits that once funded Escobar's empire continued to circulate through new hands, proving that while individuals die, systems adapt. The story of the Medellín Cartel is not merely one of crime, but of transformation. It marked the first global drug empire built on industrial-scale logistics, marketing, and violence. It showed how one commodity could reshape economies, governments, and lives across continents. It forced nations to rethink borders, intelligence, and international law. In the years following Escobar's death, Colombia sought to reclaim control over its narrative. Programs to replace coca with legal crops were introduced. Peace negotiations with guerrilla groups began, aiming to end decades of internal conflict. Yet the shadow of narco-trafficking persisted. Coca cultivation fluctuated, often rising whenever economic instability returned. For farmers in remote regions, the coca plant remained both livelihood and curse. The Medellín story continued to shape global policy. Anti-narcotics operations expanded into Peru, Bolivia, and Mexico, spreading the same war that had once consumed Colombia. As cartels diversified into human trafficking, arms trade, and cybercrime, the lessons of Medellín became warnings about how easily wealth and violence intertwine, and how hard it is to dismantle systems built on desperation and greed. By the 2010s, decades after Escobar's death, his descendants and former associates lived in anonymity, scattered across continents. His son, Juan Pablo, publicly renounced his father's legacy, writing books and speaking about the cost of power and violence. Former cartel members gave interviews describing the chaos from within, painting a picture far removed from the myth that once glorified them. Medellín itself changed. Once one of the most dangerous cities on earth, it became a model of urban renewal. Cable cars connected hillside barrios to the city center, libraries and schools replaced gang strongholds, and cultural projects transformed the skyline. Yet beneath the progress, older generations remembered the years when every explosion in the distance carried a name: Escobar, Laura Bonilla, Galan. Globally, the cocaine trade continued, reshaped but unbroken. From the jungles of South America to ports in Europe and Africa, the routes established in the 1980s still pulsed with movement. Modern traffickers used drones, encrypted apps, and international shipping containers, but the foundation had been laid decades earlier by men in Medellín who first realized that 1 kilo of powder could change the world. The rise and fall of the Medellín Cartel was more than a criminal saga. It was the blueprint for modern organized crime. It demonstrated how corruption, inequality, and global demand could converge to create an empire that defied nations. When Escobar fell, he left behind no successor capable of ruling with the same mixture of terror and charisma, but his empire's mechanisms, routes, labs, money laundering systems, survived, adopted by others who learned from his successes and his mistakes. By the time the century turned, the cocaine boom had evolved into a permanent feature of global trade. Governments shifted from trying to eradicate production to managing its consequences. Billions were spent each year on interdiction, prevention, and rehabilitation. Yet the fundamental truth remained: where there is demand, supply will adapt. Escobar's story ended on a rooftop, but the system he built outlived him. His empire fractured into hundreds of pieces, scattering across continents like dust from a fallen monument. Each new generation of traffickers inherited the lessons of Medellín, the power of fear, the reach of money, and the illusion of control. The cocaine boom that began in the jungles of Colombia in the 1970s had become a permanent chapter of global history, written in blood, ambition, and powder.